Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our first Basic Report Designer class. This is session 1 in our Report Designer series. My name is Jeanette, and I'll be your instructor today. I'm a certified Sage 300 consultant. I have over 40 years experience with the software, so hopefully I'm going to be able to show you some things in Report Designer that you might not be aware of if you are already designing reports. Or if you're new to this application, hopefully this is going to be a good introduction in how to design the reports yourself. Just another reminder, there are some handouts attached to the GoToWebinar screen. If you look under handouts, if you can get the Word document printed out, we're going to be following along with that handout, and it'll be a good place for you to take notes as we go. All right, so our agenda for today, we're going to talk a little bit about an overview, kind of some features with the Report Designer application, and then we're going to talk about the data structure itself. It's extremely important for you to understand how your data is stored and where the information is coming from on the reports that you may be designing. So we'll have a discussion about that. Then we're going to talk about one of my big things, and that's report planning. To be successful with your report design, you need to have a good understanding of what it is that the people in your company are wanting out of this report. If you don't have a good plan in place before you start, it's going to take you a long time to get that report done, and a lot of frustration of back and forth, trying to figure out what the individuals want. Once we talk about that, we're actually going to plan an AP report in this class. Then we're going to jump into the software, and we're going to take a look at what I call design basics. We're going to look at the sections that make up the report, and we're going to look at some of the basic options that you may be using during the design of your report. Right, so features with the software. To me, the design screens in Report Designer are pretty user-friendly. You'll be doing everything from one screen. That screen will be divided up into sections, and we're going to take a look at what each of those sections do. You'll be able to access all the options from that one screen. So to me, because you're not having to jump around to design this report, it's all on one screen. I feel it's pretty user-friendly. You're going to be able to create and save as many designs as your company needs. You can create these reports from scratch. Each design will have its own unique name with an extension on the end of .rpt. You can also modify any of the designs that are supplied by Sage. They send literally hundreds and hundreds of reports with the software. So when you do the install, there is a report folder that's created, and all of these designs are copied into that folder. Not all the reports that come with the software are listed on the drop-down menu. If you are looking for something that doesn't exist on the drop-down, I would recommend that you look first in the report folder to see if Sage hasn't provided something that is exactly what you want or comes close to what you want. Those reports can be copied, so they can be really a starting place for any new report that you may want to design. So instead of going totally from scratch, you can copy one of the Sage reports to a new name and go in and modify it. What I don't recommend is that you modify the reports that come with Sage, only because when you do your upgrades, those reports may get overridden with, again, the standard report that comes from Sage. So you will have overridden one of those designs potentially that you're using on a regular basis. So be sure that if you're going to modify any designs from Sage, be sure that you give those reports a new name. Now, these reports can have as much detail, or they can be summarized kind of in any variation, depending on what you've pulled into the report. So keep that in mind too when you're planning this report. You need to know if the person asking for this report, or it's yourself, how much detail do you want to see printed on the page or displayed on the screen? Is it full detail, partial detail, or is it summary information? Now, in addition to all the fields that we can pull out of the records within the data, we can also create and use formulas within the design. So if you need a calculated amount, we can do formulas. We're going to be actually covering formulas in session 2 of this series, but I'm going to talk about this again in the planning, because you need to know when you make your report plan which one of these columns on the report does not come from a specific field within that record, where you do need to create a formula. So we need to figure out what that formula needs to be and make plans to put that into the design. Now, the one thing I want to point out about the report designer, it's very basic, meaning we don't put in logos, we don't draw boxes, we can draw lines, we can change fonts in each of the individual columns on the report. We can also change colors. So when you click on the font option, where on that window, and I'll show you when we get into the software, there will be an option there to change the color of the value that's going to print in that column. But that's about as fancy as we can get. Like I said, we don't do boxes, we don't do shading, we can't pull in company logos. And lastly, we can assign security to the report design itself. So you still have the Sage security to keep people from running the report. Additionally, and we'll talk about this in session 2, you can assign security to the design itself so that no one can go in and make changes to it after you've created it. Okay, so starting on page 1 of the Word document handout, we're going to talk about the Sage data structure. And I'm pretty sure you're all really familiar with this concept, that Sage is storing all your data for a particular company in a folder. So you have Sage data folders out there that you're accessing to go in and process your information through the accounting. And then within that folder are specific data files. And 2 of them that I'm sure you're aware of right now are the master file, which holds static information, so names, addresses, phone numbers, and summary totals. And then the transaction files, which hold the detail that potentially makes up the balances in those master files. So new being the unposted, current being the posted, and history being your archived or moved transactions. So it's important for you to understand the difference between those file types so that when you're running the report, you select the right transaction file. Now, it's not going to prompt you for the master file unless this is an AP report, because AP does hold not only vendor records, but it also holds invoice records and check records in that master file as well. The other applications will not ask you to select a master file, because each of those can only have one master and they only hold static and summary totals. The transaction part, you need to understand the difference between new, current, and history when you run the report so that you are getting the correct transactions, either posted or not posted. Now, the records within those files, the records within new, current, and history are exactly the same. So when we're designing the report, we're going to pull the specific record that we want into the design, and then from there, we're going to select specific fields off those records. Now, new, current, and history will have multiple records within those files. So in payroll, as an example, you're going to have, in your current file, you're going to have time records and check records and check pay records and deducts and taxes. So all of those records exist in all three of those files. So when we're creating the design, it's not asking us for the file at that point. It knows you're going to select the file when you run the report. So I've got an example for you in the middle of page 1. It shows what a vendor table might look like. So we've got, a record for each vendor inside the AP master file. And then within that vendor record, there are fields for the vendor ID, the name, address, city, state, depending on the record we've selected, we'll see a list of files that we can, fields that we can choose from. Now, to keep that information straight, what Sage has done is they have developed something called a data dictionary. Each one of these records has a data dictionary inside the software. So when you're designing the report, we're going to display for you on one side of the screen the data dictionary for that particular record. And you're going to see things like the field name. We're going to, on the printout of a data dictionary, you're going to see the field type, how wide that field is, whether it's ODBC replaceable, does it have any special values, hard-coded, and then what are the standard orders for that record. Now, a record, each one of these records is going to have something called a key. And that's what the standard order means. So in order to organize the data within that record, each record has at least one standard order or standard key, which is the index to that record. So it's telling the system how to find each of those records when you run the report. So as an example, when you design, let's say, an AP report and you're using the AP vendor record, you're adding vendors, daily, weekly, monthly, and they're in random order. And as they're written into the AP master file, they are stored in random order, but it's writing an address to that record on that vendor record, so that when you run the report, it looks at that address and pops that vendor up right away. And it's kind of the same concept when you go into setup vendor or setup job. It's actually reading the key or the standard order to that record to be able to pop that information up on the screen right away. Otherwise, it would have to sort through. If it didn't have a key or an index, it would have to sort through that record constantly trying to find the vendor or the employee or the job that you're looking for. All right, so I'm going to jump into the software here for a second, and I'm going to show you how you can find these data dictionaries. If you take a look at page 2 in your handout, inside Report Designer, if you go to Tools, Available Fields, you will get the screen that shows you all the different records for every application. These are in alphabetical order by the 2-character abbreviation for that application. So in Accounts Payable, now the actual records themselves are kind of grouped together by file type. So this first batch of records we're looking at here, these are all invoice records. So all you do is just click on the record that you want to get a printout for. And then I'm going to come down here and also pick the vendor record. So pick the record or records that you need to see. Click OK. And then on this screen where it says Include Information for ODBC Reporting, if you're maybe trying to do something with Crystal or some other program that's going to be interfacing with Sage, you need to check this box so that you get some additional information on the printout of the data dictionary. So I'm just going to do a print preview here. All right, so I'm looking at, first up here at the top, you can see that we're looking at the AP invoice record. And notice what it says here. It's not ODBC creatable, which means you can't create an invoice through, let's say, Access and have it set it up inside Sage. Any of the transaction records, just kind of keep this in mind. Master file records, yes. Transaction file records, no. They are not ODBC creatable. So this has got again, we've got a field name column, shows us the actual name of the field. This is the internal name. So again, any interface outside of Sage, you might have to use the internal name to get to that particular field. We've got a field type. We've got a length. Don't worry about the code. I'm not exactly sure what the code means. Replaceable, if there's an X in that column, that means that you can interface with maybe something like Access or Excel, and you can actually replace this field with that program. And then under special values, these are hard-coded values within Sage. So we can see the status field here is not something that you maintain yourself. Timberline or Sage is maintaining that. If it's still open, hasn't been paid yet, or is maybe even partially paid, the status on it is going to remain open until it's fully paid, and then Sage will change the status to fully paid. So looking at this, we've got some more special fields down here with the batch source. This is just telling you you can include this in a report to see where a particular record came from. Now, if I come down here to the bottom, the standard orders are at the very bottom of the printout for that record. And the first one, this is the default order. So this report, if we didn't make any changes to the sort order, it would print in vendor invoice order. Now, you can change the sort order by selecting one of these other order types, or you can even create a custom sort, which we're going to talk about when we get into the software to design our report. All right, this next record, here's the AP vendor record. It is ODBC replaceable, which means that you can have Access, as an example, set vendors up. You can go in through an Access routine and actually have that routine create a vendor record over in Sage. So that's why all these X's here too, these are all replaceable fields. So we've got the name, we've got an internal name, we've got a field type, we've got a length, we've got whether it's replaceable, and then under special values, quite a few of these have system maintained values. And these values can be used for conditions, or you can actually print the value. It'll actually print it on the report. That's something that you can select. Okay. And again, if we scroll to the bottom of the last page, we see standard orders. So the standard order, the default, order number 1 is by vendor. Order number 2, if we want to switch this and print by name, we actually have an option to switch it, and I'll show you that when we get into the software. Now, one thing I would recommend that you do as you start designing reports in the system, I would print these out. It's easier to see all the available fields if you've got it right in front of you on paper that you can easily scan through and you can see those values. I would even start, as you start doing these, print the records out that you're going to be using and then save them. Maybe start a 3-ring binder that holds all of these different data dictionaries for you. Now on page 3 at the top, I've described some of the values here in the data dictionary. I've got at the top, described what each of those columns mean. And then again, describing what the standard orders are. That's at the top of page 3. Okay, and that's what this screenshot is also, again, saying, that each record has a primary key. Again, it's going to be standard order number 1. And then if it has any alternate keys, those will be listed under that first primary key. Now, record relationships. This is at the bottom of page 3. If you're pulling multiple records into a report design, you need to understand a couple of these relationships. The one-to-many is the first one that I have, actually one-to-one in your handout on page 3, means it's a one-to-one, one-to-one is relationship, meaning one vendor to one invoice. That's considered a one-to-one. Or I'm sorry, the invoice itself is only linked to one vendor. The one-to-many above that flips it around the other direction. So one vendor can have multiple invoices recorded to it. So we have one-to-many, so one vendor, multiple invoices, or one-to-one, which is one invoice only going assigned to one vendor, and then a none. Now, the reason that you need to understand this is when we get into the printing of the reports, you may have the one-to-many relationship going, and you're not understanding why you're getting all these lines in the report. It's because you've got multiple invoices to that vendor, so you may want to summarize. If it's the other way around and your driving record is the invoice record, you're going to see that one vendor assigned to each invoice in that grouping. Now, the none relationship, this is going to become important when we get into session 2 of report designing. If there is no relationship between the records, we can build a relationship with a function. So, like the example that's given here, check to invoice. If you look at a check record in AP, it does not have an invoice number within that record as a field. So there's no relationship there. But we can tell the system with a formula/function to go out and find that invoice record that goes with that check. Okay, so one-to-one, one-to-many, none. Those are the 3 main ones. There's a 4th one in your handout for those of you that might be doing property management. There's a many-to-many option, and I think PM is the only place in the software that actually has that relationship. Okay, page 4. Planning your report. This is very important, and what I've got on page 5 is kind of a example of maybe creating a worksheet for yourself to gather information before you actually sit down in the software to create the report. So the purpose of this is to make it easier for you to get that report in place for people to start using. So the first thing on the list then is purpose. What is the purpose of the report? And is there something else already existing in the software that they can use in place of it? Or is this really a needed report design? And then who needs this report? Is it just one person, or are there multiple people? And if there are multiple people, then you need to make sure that all the people who need this report have input into it so that they're getting what they want. And then I would, as far as the layout, I would get information about what they want to see at the top of each page in the header. How does the body of the report look? How are the Is it detail or is it summarized? Are there column headings above each of those lines? Do they need a footer at the bottom of the page? What records do you need to pull to accomplish this report? So where is the information going to come from? And again, the data dictionary is what's going to help you with that. If you print out the data dictionary for the vendor and the invoice, if you know that's where the information is going to come from, do you see all the records that you need? And then the processing record. When you are using more than one record in a report design, one of those records has to become the driving record or the processing record of the report. And what that means is that as the report runs, it looks to that driving record or processing record or primary record to see if there is a value there. Now, a good example of this, I'm going to give General Ledger as an example. You've pulled a report to print transactions out of the transaction file, and you've got some information coming from the GL master file, or where the accounts are. By default, the system will pull the transaction record as being the primary or driving record, and that's because it has the most detail in it. So the system will always select for you to start with, and it's going to pick the one with the most information. And what that means is that if you leave it that way, when you run the report, if the GL account number itself does not have any transactions, it will not print the GL account, the information from the GL account on the report, because it doesn't have any transactions, and the transaction file is the driving record. If you want to see every single account, regardless of whether or not it has detail, you would change the driving record from the transaction file or record to the master file record. And then it will print every GL account number, regardless of whether they have transactions or not. We're going to talk more about that when we get into the software, because we're going to do a report that is the AP invoice and the AP master file. Okay, the sort order. By default, it's going to print by the primary key or the standard order number 1. If that's not the order that the person who is requesting this report wants the report to print by, you need to find out from them what order they want that report in. And then you may have to create a custom sort for them. Are there any conditions on this report? Meaning filters. Do they want everything to print, or do they only want certain types of records to print? We can set criteria for that so that it ignores the records that they don't want. Formulas. Do we need to create any formulas, or are all the values in those records that we've selected? If not, then we need to decide what that formula is going to look like. And then lastly, totaling. How do we want this report to total? Are there multiple levels of total, or do we just want one report total at the very end? So again, I've given you a blank. First on page 5 is a blank, kind of a layout worksheet where you can write in the column headings across the top, the report title. You can fill in how you want the information to print down the page. You can tell it whether or not to give you any subtotals, and then a grand total. You can write in, I've got a field there for the records, the sort order, formulas. I've even added page breaking and line spacing. And if you see on page 6, I've filled one out for you so that you can kind of see what it might look like before you sit down to actually design the report. Okay. All right. So let's jump into the software now. We've got something to look at first before we actually start creating. There is a section here under tools options that, tools customize. I'm going to jump there. Tools options is exactly the same regardless of where you are in the software. You see the same tabs and the same fields. But under Tools Customize, when you're in the report design, you have a few more tabs here that you can deal with if you want to change anything from the default. So we're going to skip this first row here of tabs because that is outside of the report design. That you can see these tabs anywhere in the software. If we look at preferences, this what we see here is when we go into the into the totaling. There's some totaling places. Sorry. Yeah, I've got descriptions here. I think in your handout on page 8, as far as the page headings are concerned. The column headings, whether they're all caps or just initial caps, how to handle negative amounts. This is important if you are creating a report that's going to be downloaded to Excel. You need to make sure you change this to put the minus in front. I would make a note of that on page 8 where it says default negative format. And then you've got some prompt fields down here below. We can actually put design notes in. I'll show you where those are in session 2. We can make it prompt you to do that. We can give warnings on the fonts. And then field list expands design window. What this means that after you create the design and then you come back in to make changes, you want the field list to automatically come in. Otherwise it won't. It'll just be, you'll just see the header, the body, and the footer. So I'm going to change this so that it pops back in. All right, colors, you can change foreground and background. So background is white and foreground is black. It's the default. It's just black and white. If you want to change that, you can. If you want to change the options that show up on the total screen or tab or window, when you're setting up the totals for the report, this is the default. The default indicator is a single asterisk, and the checkboxes as far as when to, or if you're dropping totals, or you want higher totals to print when you print the grand total. Do you want the grand total on a brand new page? What's the spacing between the detail and the and the total? It defaults to double. And you can even mark this to automatically create totals. So as you are building the design, it will automatically put the totals in. I'm going to leave this blank because most of the time the totaling is you're selecting what it is that you want to either total or summarize by. So I think this would be too confusing. I would leave this unchecked. Page headings, the default here is to print the company name. I would uncheck this record security. This wastes space up in the header of the design, and if you forget to uncheck it when you go to the page heading area, your heading at the top, it's going to be like multiple lines long or wide, and that's because, or deep, and that's because it's trying to print all these record security values over on the right-hand side up at the top. So I would uncheck this record security so you don't have to worry about that. Now, if you always want the design name to print up in the header, you can put a check mark there. Even the output file. So if you want the print file name to print up at the top, you can check that as well. So these, again, these are defaults that we're going to have on every single report that we create. Now you can override these values on a report by report basis if you don't want to come in here at the first and set these defaults up. And the same with the view. We're going to default our view as just a normal view. I'm going to talk about a couple of these when we get into creating the report. And then initially, it's going to open up header, footer, and field list. Okay. All right, and I've got descriptions of most of these field values for you in your handout up through page 10. Okay, let's start a new design. So you've come into Report Designer, and you've got a blank screen here. Up at the top, you're going to go to File, New Design. And that's going to bring up the record selection screen. So here, depending on your design, you're going to pick the records that you need to pull information from on this report. And in this report, we're going to pull from the invoice record, and we're going to pull from the vendor record. Right? Once you have your record selected, click OK. Now, one thing to make a note of in your book. We can add more records to the design once we get inside and we figure out that, oops, we forgot one. We can actually index back to this window and add more. What we can't do is take records off. So if you pulled one in by mistake and you've got the whole report designed and you decide, oh, I didn't need that record at all in this report, there's no way to take it back off. Notice that there's no arrows going back and forth here. When you highlight a record, it goes in. Now, at this point, if I don't need the record, before I click OK, all I do is click it again to unselect it, and it takes it off the list. Okay. So keep that in mind, that you can add and remove at this point, but once you select OK, when you add more, you cannot remove records off the report. All right, once you say OK, it brings us into the design window, basically. So there are a couple of parts to this window. This first part up the top, this is your header. Everything down to this solid gray line here, or thicker gray line, is considered the header area. The header is divided into two parts. Above the black triangle, this is the area that will actually print on the report. So above the black arrow triangle and the pink dotted line, this prints. Anything that you add in here under the pink line does not print on the report when you print it. So you could put text in here, instructions, or some other verbiage, and like I said, it will not print on the report. Only things that are above the pink line actually print. Now, below this thicker gray line, this is the body of the report. So all the fields that we're going to print on this report, we're going to add into this area. Now, below this, and I'm not sure why it does this, but it didn't pull in the footer. If you go to View and just click on Footer, it will actually bring that in. So down here below the thick area is the footer. And again, to drag that down, anything above the pink will not print. Anything below the pink will print. So when it first pops up, that pink line is not there, and you can pull fields in here, descriptions, and this will print on the report. So I'm going to take the footer off. Most people don't do a footer unless they're trying to do some type of a form. All right, over on the far right is your field list. So it's giving us a list of fields from the driving record or the primary processing record. And notice what it popped in here. It popped in the AP invoice record, not the vendor record. it pulled in the AP invoice record because that record has the most detail, or that, yeah. So if we decided that we wanted the vendor to be the driving record, we could actually change that under the sort order. We have a chance, and I would do this right away. We have a chance here under Process All to select vendors instead. And I'll come back to this window a little bit further into the setup. But just so you know, you can change this to one of the other records if you need to. Okay, so again, header at the top, body in the middle, footer at the bottom if you've got it displayed, field list on the side. Now, if you come into a design and this field list is not displayed, you see this little button right up here at the top. It looks like an arrow pointing into a piece of paper. That's your field list button. If you click on it, it removes it. Click again, and it brings it back. You can also get it to go on and off right here under View. So there's multiple ways to turn it on and off. You can do it with the little icon button, or you can use the View drop-down, again, to make it go away, to bring it back. Okay. Now, at the top of page 12 in your handout, this is what we were just looking at. So this is where you can control the field list. You can control the 3 other areas in the design. Also, the kind of the view or the display of what we see in the body. Now, today we're going to be talking about normal and also about print controls. When we come back for session 2, we'll talk about suppressed areas and conditional print areas. But for today, we're going to focus in 2 areas. Okay. Now, at the bottom of page 12, the page headings. So if we come here under File and go to Page Setup and go to Page Headings, we can see our defaults. So here's where we can change the report title. We can, this is where it says invoice report. This is where it's pulling that from. The company name is pulled right here. We're telling it to print page numbers, and once we assign a report name or design to this report, it will actually show the design name up here in the header. Now you can also control some system type things. There's where it says use system defaults. It's not printing the system time and the system date for us by default. So if you have a report design where you need to see when this report was run, I would uncheck use system defaults, and then you can pull in the system date and the system time. And even data file names, but then again, that is going to increase how deep this page header is. So if data file names are not that important to you, I would not check that. But maybe system date and system time, if you run this report multiple times during the day, that might be important information for you to have on the report. Okay, I'm going to drag this up. You can actually, if you click your cursor on that line, you can actually pull it up so you have more room to work down in the body of the report. Now, adding information to the report design. You need to make sure that your cursor, you see this little flashing black line here? That's my cursor. I'm going to move that down so that I have enough room up above for the headings, the column headings. If you're too high up, the column headings are going to show up underneath the field. So position your cursor where you want this first field to print, and then over on the field list, all you do is double-click the field. And it brings the field and its column heading into the design. The the field itself is surrounded by dashed lines, and then it will pull in a default heading above that field. And you can change this. You can move it. You can change it. If you decide that that's not the heading that you want, all the text field information can be changed. And the fields themselves, we can move those. We can move those around. So what we're going to do, we're going to follow the report layout that we had on page 6. So I'm down here in the body of the report, and I'm going to go ahead and pull the vendor's name right next to the vendor ID. So I'm going to put my cursor at the just outside the vendor, and I'm going to use my index button at the bottom of this field list. I need to get over to the vendor record because the vendor's name is not on the invoice record, right? So I need to index, which brings up a list of the records that I have available to me in this design, and I need to go to the vendor record. So you can highlight the record and then click OK at the bottom, and that will take you, or you can double click. Right? So right here, I'm going to highlight the name, and I'm going to double click, and it adds it over in the design. Now underneath that, I want the address to print. So again, from the vendor record, I'm going to double click on the address. Now notice what happened here. It wants to bring in a heading, but it can't because there's already a header in that spot. So this window will pop up when you're adding records underneath existing records, and there's no place for it to add the record description. So I don't need it to say address 1, so I'm going to leave this check mark here where it says remove column headings, and I'm just going to click the retry, and it brings the address in with no change up here to the headings. Okay, right underneath there, I need to see city, state, zip, so I'm going to go with city, and again, I'm going to tell it to remove that column heading and just retry. And then right next to it, I'm going to grab the state, and then right next to it, I'm going to grab the zip. Now, if I don't want to see these headings right here, I can just highlight them out with a block, and then click the delete button on my keyboard, and that removes them. And I could probably do the same with vendor and name. I don't actually need to see that because I'll see the ID and the name. That's kind of self-explanatory, so I will go ahead and delete that. So I've got in that first column, I've got where the information that I want to see about the vendor information. So now let's say I want to start adding the rest of the columns, and the rest of those columns are going to come off of my invoice record. So I'm going to use the index button. I'm going to come back to AP invoice, and I'm going to start adding more information here. So the first thing I want to do is position my cursor where I want to see that information, and I'm going to double click on invoice, and it pops that field in there. And then maybe I decide, that's not where I want that field to actually be. So I've got a couple of things that I can do. On page 15, it talks about deleting and moving information around. So I can put my cursor on that field, and I can have a couple ways to do this. I can click on Edit, and I can click on Clear. And then it's going to ask me, do you want to get rid of that field from the design? Sure. Now what it didn't do, it did not get rid of my description. So again, I have to make sure I get rid of it that way. So the other things that I can do with this, okay, so maybe I should have, I can delete. So again, I can highlight, I can click Edit, I can click Delete, or I can use the delete on my keyboard. And it does the same thing. Get rid of that. All right. And the other thing I can do, and this is a little more common. Whoops, cancel that. Put my cursor down here. Double click on the field. I can actually move fields around on the design. So maybe I do want this field, but it's in the wrong place. So I can click on the field and then holding my cursor down, notice how my cursor changes into the arrows pointing in 4 directions. I can move this field all over the place here. I can actually move it and get it out here away from the vendor information. So I can, as soon as I have it in the position that I want, I just let go of the cursor and it moves it. And I would probably do the same with the invoice description. It's just click and drag. Okay. The other thing I can do is if I've got, the field is out in an area where I've got room to move, I can draw a line here between where that field is and the field to the left of it. And then I can use this little symbol right here to slide the information over. Now notice it draws a line, and as I move my cursor to the right, it moves everything to the right of that line, it moves it out. So if I need to make space, maybe I forgot a field, maybe I need to get the invoice date in here. So I can move that out. I can click my cursor back here and I can come down and I can find the invoice date. Okay. All right. And then, I've got too much space here. So I've got a couple ways I can do it. I can draw another line and I can move this invoice back. So if I draw the line here and I click on the slide button, I can actually go this way, moving it back that way. Or if I block out the whole thing and then click into one of the fields, I can drag it back this way. Okay. So the slide button moves left and right. Blocking the fields out, you can move up and down and left and right. You can move things out of the way. I could move it down here in the body until I get it built the way I need it to, and then I can reblock and move it back up into the design. So it just depends on what it is you need to do, whether you need to make space between 2 fields, or you need to move something out of the way to build more into the report before you move that value back. What I'm trying to say is you don't have to delete stuff out of the design in order to add more to it. You can move stuff out of the way, add the information in, and then move that value back. All right, so let's go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to leave the date there. I'm going to grab the description, the invoice description, and pull that in. I'm also going to pull in the amount. Okay. Now, again, the processing record, I want to come back into that. This is located under the design drop-down, and it's on the sort order window. Right now, we're saying print just AP invoices. So any vendor that does not have an invoice will not be on the report. And we're printing this in vendor invoice order. Okay. So I'm going to OK that, leave it the way it is, and let's just do a print preview here. I can use this button right here if I want to do a test run to see what it looks like. I'm going to click this, and it brings up my data file selection window. And the reason it does that is because I have multiple records here. So it shows me here the driving record and then the file that I want to pull from. I'm going to pull from the master file. So these would be posted invoices. I'm going to click OK. And then I get my print selection window. I'm just going to do a print preview. And we see, here's what we see. Okay, so I'm looking at that. I'm like, well, you know what? Maybe I don't need the date. I'm going to make some make some changes to this report. So I'm going to go ahead and close that and cancel. This column right here, I don't think I really want that in there at this point, so I'm going to go ahead and delete that out. And then I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to block this all out, and I'm going to move this back over a little farther, maybe, because it just looked too strung out there. Maybe move it down one. Yeah, okay, kind of like that. So let's print preview that again. See if it looks a little bit cleaner. It kind of does. Okay. There's kind of a lot of space up in here. Don't like that too much. So let's cancel that. I'm going to block this out here and kind of move it down so they're a little bit closer. And maybe block this out, move it up so there's not so much space. And then maybe I want all my vendors to print. So I'm going to come back up here to Design Sort Order, and I'm going to change the processing to vendors. And maybe I want to see it in name order instead of vendor or ID order. Because remember, this is an alternate key. Okay, so I'm going to OK that. And now let me take a look at what that looks like. That's looking a little bit better. Okay. So again, so you've got some options there as you start to build this report. What I would recommend is that you do a little and then you do a test run to see what it looks like. The other thing I'm going to recommend that you do on a regular basis is that you save this design. So I'm going to save this. I'm going to give this report name RD class and save it. And as I keep making changes, every once in a while, I'm going to re-click on this Save button. The reason for that is that I've had some pretty complicated report designs that after you get to a certain point, every once in a while, it'll come back and tell you that the report designer has stopped. Once it does that, you've just lost all your changes. So if you are doing complicated reports and doing complicated formulas within that report, I would make it a habit of hitting that Save button every once in a while so that you don't lose a lot of work as you go. Okay, the sort order is described to you again a little more on page 18. If you go to page 19, at the top of page 19, it talks about some of the other things that the sort order does. It defines what your total levels are going to be and your summary levels. So when we are ready to assign totals to this report, we're going to come up here to Design Totals. And what you're going to see in the total box and the summary box is based on what the sort order is for the design. So you need to be aware of that. If you come in here to the totals window and you don't see the field that you want a total by, you're going to have to change your sort order so that it includes that field. Otherwise, you will not be able to total by it. Okay. The other things that it does, the line spacing and the page breaks, we're going to get to that a little further into the design. But just be aware of that. The page, and there's also page breaks that we can assign, print controls that we can assign, and it also has to do with some of the formulas. So that asum is a function that you can put into a formula to accumulate levels of totals. So you need to be aware. I would circle that at the top of page 19. That the sort order is not just for determining the order that the stuff is going to print in. It affects other things within the design. Now, if you need to create a custom sort, so let me come back in here. The way that you do that, I'm going to change our processing record back to invoice, and we're going to set up a custom sort here. You do this on the using the custom sort button, and this is also on page 19 in your handout. It gives you a window here where you can select the fields that you want to sort by. So we're going to sort this this custom sort. We're going to index over to the vendor record. We're going to sort by name, and then within each name, go back to the invoice record, we want it by invoice. And when I OK that, you'll see that I've got a custom sort now. It's got asterisks around it. That means that this is a custom sort. It's not one of the standard orders. I want it by name and then by invoice number within that name. And now if I take a look at my total area, notice that I've got name and invoice totals. And I can summarize by name and by invoice. So that custom sort is reflected now on this totals window. So again, if your field isn't here, you've got to create a custom sort for that. The other thing about the custom sort, let me come back in here. Notice the ascending and descending. You can sort it backwards if you want to. The default is smallest to largest. If you want it the other direction, just change it to descending. Okay. And the other thing I want to point out about these field lists, this is a good place to actually do that. You've got a couple of buttons here at the bottom. This index button again brings up the records in the design that are available for the custom sort. Find lets you type in a field name, and it will go there. And then how do I get out of there? Okay. And then order. If you want to see the fields in alphabetical order, just click the order button, and you can select that as an option. And then it puts the fields in alphabetical order. The group by context, that's the default, and what that means is it's going to show you the fields in the master file and in the transaction file in the order that you see them when you're actually running the software. So the vendor record will show all your fields tab by tab in that order. And the invoice will show you the fields in order by how you enter it when you're entering the information in on an entry grid. So it just depends on what your comfort level is, alphabetical order, or if you're used to scrolling through and looking for things grouped together. Okay. Oh, one more button I forgot. Erase last. If you start building your custom sort and you left one out, there's not an insert button here. You have to erase last from the bottom. It starts at the bottom. Erase up to where that field needs to go, put that field in, and then re-enter the rest of the fields. Okay. So no insert. Right. Field formats. The different types of fields have different options to them. So at the bottom of page 20, if you are looking at a kind of a text field like invoice, if you highlight the field and double click on it, you'll see the values or the format for this particular field. So this is pulling up based on the data dictionary, the width, and then the justification, and then if it's longer than that, it'll abbreviate. Or if you make the length less than what the default is, and that value, let's say the value of that invoice is really 15, but you change the length to scrunch up so that you have enough room to get everything on the report, and you made it 10, it will abbreviate that invoice. Same with the description. We see the same field set of values for that type of field. The amount, if we double click there, we've got a little bit more information. This is the second screen on page 21. So the defaults come up, what signed, meaning it'll put a minus sign if it's negative, it's going to print commas. It's set to total this field by default because it is an amount field. So when we assign totals, this is the field that will give us a total. It's got a default length, number of decimal places 2, and then you can also suppress decimals. The justification is right because it's a number, it's going to round. No fill means it's going to be, if the field is blank, it's going to be blank if there's nothing there. If you want it to show up as with zeros, you can change that. When you're trying to make space on a report, I think the reports have a maximum width of 230 to 250 spaces going across the report. If you've got enough information that you're going to go over that, what I would recommend is that you come back on the dollar. I would start with the dollar amounts, strip out the commas, maybe on some of the columns where you know that they don't need this much space, change the length so that you start creating some empty space for yourself. Now the date column or the date field, pull in an invoice date. This got a different look to it. This is at the top of page 21. So you can change the format. It's using the default, which is month, day, year. If you want to use one of these other options on this scroll bar, just uncheck default and then scroll up and down and find the format that you would like to use. So date, I think we should add back into our, you can add that back into our design, but let's move that. Let's move this over here. I think that might look a little bit better. And we'll get rid of that header. Okay, I'm going to click the save to save that again. All right, let's talk about the view. We're looking at the normal view, which is black descriptive stuff on white with a white background. So we can't really tell by looking at this how often the values are going to print, and sometimes that's an important piece of information. So we're going to change this view to print controls, and this is on page 22 in your handout. Okay, so the headers are now navy blue, so we know that is a header for the columns and for the page heading at the top. The rest of this is black. If we click into one of these fields, we can see down here at the bottom, there's a little area here that says print once per, and it says invoice record. So if we were to run this report right now, let's actually run it so that you can see what it does. Look what it does. It's repeating this information for the vendor on every single invoice. Well, that's not what we want. So let's close that and cancel. We're going to change the print control on this group of fields. These fields are coming straight out of the vendor file, and we don't need to see it for every single invoice. So we're going to click down here on this bar that says print once per invoice record, and it brings up a print control window where we can say print once per vendor name. And we'll OK that. Notice the color change. And if we click into one of these fields, it tells us there here down at the bottom how often this is going to print. So it's going to print every time the name changes. The items in black are going to change every time the invoice changes. So every time this invoice number changes, it's going to print a new line. Okay. Now, the options that we have in here, notice that it's got name and invoice, which is our custom sort. So again, if you've got something missing from this window, you need to change your custom sort. And then depending on what you select, you can tell it to reprint when the group is continued on a new page. This might be good for the name. So you've got a vendor that's got a lot of invoices and it breaks between page 1 and page 2. We might want to see that happen. Go to another page, or print the name, reprint the this information on the second page, which, let me get up here, that's not where I wanted it to do. I want to do it on this group. I want this to reprint when it's on when it goes to a second page. Okay. So print controls are important when you are dealing with detail. If you're printing everything from a master file, you don't need to worry about print controls. But if you have a combination of records, you do need to turn on the print control view so that you can see what those controls look like, what the groupings are, and how often they're going to print. Now, I've got an example for you at the top of page 22 that your page headings should print on each page. Your column headings should repeat on each page. And then the vendor ID and name should be once per vendor or name, and it should continue if the invoices go to a second page. And then as far as the detail is concerned, it should print once for each invoice, which is what we've got. Now let's turn on our totals so that you can see the print controls for them. I'm going to go ahead again and save our design. And let's turn on our totals. And we're going to say we want report totals, and we also want name totals, meaning at the end of each vendor. So we're going to OK that. And notice the colors again. Okay, so report totals, I'm going to move this over here so it prints closer. And notice the print control. It's printing at the end of the report. Now, this is a vendor total. Notice the colors match. And if I click here, it's saying I'm going to print at the end of the name. So if I click here, you'll see that it's marked at end of group. And it's a total. And I might put here, I might give it a description, so it's not just hanging out there all by itself. And let's move this over so it's closer. Maybe line it up so vendor total and well, I still didn't get it right. I just have to play with it. Okay. So now let's take a look at what our design looks like. So here we go. We've got totals coming in, and if we go to the end of the last page, we have a grand total for the report. Okay. So on page 22 and 23, there are examples of what we just looked at. And then on page 24, where we have it set to print once, the name to print once per vendor. On page 25, we're looking at our totaling screen. So let me come back to that. And let me show you, if I were to say, I want to summarize by invoice or summarize by name. Maybe I don't need to see the actual detail. So this here, this box right here, is what controls whether you see detail or you see summary. Now let me show you what happens. It actually took away the vendor total because we don't need it. We're summarizing by the vendor. If I were to run this report now, I get a total, and this total is by vendor, but look at what happens to the invoice and the description. If you run a design, if you create one and run it, and you're getting dashed lines in the columns, that means your summary is too high. It doesn't know what to print here because we told it to summarize by invoice, and they've got multiple invoices. So it can't print the invoice or the date or the description. Okay. So dashes mean that back here on our total line, we have to move it back up. We have to move up. You would keep moving up until you get the values to print. Or you change what you've got printing here in the body of the report. You need to get rid of these fields because they're no longer valid. Now the total indicator and these two checkboxes came from our tools customize window. So these are the defaults. We told it to do a single asterisk and to drop the total if only one group prints. What that means is if this vendor only has one invoice, it's not going to print a vendor total for us. It's only going to print if they have more than one invoice. Now we could, if we want to, get the report totals to go on a new page. Or we could say, oh, you know what, I don't need the body of this report, just give me the report totals. Run the report and just give me the grand total at the bottom. All right, I'm going to save this again. One thing I'll point out, you can tell if you've got changes to your design. You see the little asterisk right here at the end of the name? Once you save, that asterisk goes away, so you know that the report has been saved. All right, past the totals, let's look at line spacing. This is at the top of page 26. We might decide here we want to double space between the vendors, but we want a single space between the invoices and the invoice records. And we might even want to single space between the names. Let's see what that looks like. So we'll go ahead and print that. That looks like even a little bit better. Now it's going to automatically, because of the way we have it set up, the vendor total is double spaced. If you don't like how that looks, then over here you can move all of this up, block it out, move it up one line. Right, so spacing is something too. If you've got a lot of records out there that you're pulling in, line spacing can group things together more cleanly. Additionally, group page breaks. Maybe you're running a report and you're going to hand this report out to certain individuals for their certain information. So let's use project manager as an example. Each project manager has their own set of jobs. So you may have designed a report that sorts by project manager and lists their jobs and maybe job to date cost. And you want to have the report do a page break by the project manager. So you would select that as an unconditional page break. So every time it gets to a new project manager, it automatically moves to a new page. And then you can tell it to reset the page number when the page breaks. So each project manager would get their own report. You could break them apart, hand them each their report. Each of their reports will start with page 1. So unconditional means as soon as that value changes, go to a new page. Conditional page break means that I want everything to fit on one page, one or multiple pages, but I only want the information for that record. How do I want to say this? Let's say we have a We want a page break after each name, a conditional page break after each name. But if the next vendor in the list has enough invoices to fit at the bottom of that page where vendor number 1 stopped, it's going to put them in there. So what we're trying to do is not split, oh gosh, this is hard to explain, not split by the name itself, but we're trying to get things, okay, let's back up. Okay, so we print vendor number 1. Vendor number 1 has enough invoices to go to page 2. There's room at the bottom of page 2 to print vendor number 2. So we print vendor number 2 at the bottom. There's not enough room to print vendor number 3 at the bottom of page 2, so now we're going to go to a new page. There's some space there, but it's not enough space to get a complete set of invoices for vendor number 3. So this is called a conditional page break. The condition is, will it fit on the page? If it doesn't fit after somebody else that's already printed, it's going to go to a new page. I know that's confusing, but I think if you play with that, or if you have a request for something like that, this is what you're going to look for. All right, we're not going to do a conditional page break, but let's do one on a unconditional on the name so you can see what that looks like. All right, so vendor number 1, page number 1. Oh, notice up here too, we've got our design name in here. So we can see what the report is, and we've got our system date and time printing. So if I hit the next button, here's the second vendor on its own page, page number 1, and so on. So again, it's up to you how you want to group this together. If it's all for the same person, then you don't need to worry about the group page breaks. Leave it at no unconditional page breaks. All right, the last thing we're going to talk about here is conditions. So on our report, let's say we only want open invoices to print. So we can select from the field list the status, and then in the operator, whether the value that we're going to compare to has to be equal to, greater than, or equal to, and so on. We'll pick an operator, and then we'll pick a value. Now, because status is one of those special fields, it has its own hard-coded values in here. It defaults to the first one in the list of open. So we can say, okay. Now, if we wanted to add more conditions to the report, we can click Add, and then it adds another connector up here at the top. We have to say and or. If there are 2 or more conditions and the record has to pass every condition, you need to leave it at and. If it only has to pass one or the other, you can change it to or. And then you select the value. You select the field, the operator, and the value. And then we'll go ahead and OK that. We'll go ahead and save. And then when we run the report, it's only showing us open invoices. Before we had a 9-page report, now we have a 5-page report because it has stripped out all the paid invoices. So if we look at the end here of our design, it dropped the value, almost cut it in half. It was over 800,000. Now it's 478. And notice we put our report totals on a separate page, so this really is only a 4-page report. Okay. So conditions then are on page 27 and 28 are described for you as far as the operators are concerned. All right, so back on our layout, I was just kind of demonstrating what the kind of an example of how to fill something out and then sit down and do the report. Now we've got everything here. I added the invoice date in front, but we've got the invoice, we've got the description, we've got the amount. There's one other field that we'll save in here, amount paid. We'll go ahead and build on this report in session 2. We've got one more column here, which is balance. Balance does not exist on the invoice record. If you look through the list of fields, there's no such thing. So this balance field is going to be a formula that we'll create next time, which will be amount minus amount paid, so that we can see any invoices that have an outstanding balance on them. Maybe we made a partial payment. We also didn't set any conditions on set the condition on the subcontractors only. So I could do that now. I could say, go back here to condition. I've got a condition that it's open. I can add that on the vendor record, I only want to see subcontractors. And I'm going to leave this as an and, so that the report will only print open invoices for subcontractors. So let me okay that. And I'll go ahead and save it one more time, and we'll run it. Okay, now we're down to 3 pages. So these are my subs with their open invoices. And here's one. Notice here that the ones that only have one invoice, I'm not getting it's not repeating a total, because I told it on the totals window to drop the total if there's only one. Now, a couple of things I could do before we go to kind of make this look a little prettier. Again, because remember I said that the report design in RD isn't super fancy like Crystal is. But one of the things I could do is maybe to make this stand out a little bit more, I can highlight these 2 fields here and I can bold. So here I've got the bold option. And maybe I want to bold the title as well, or I'm sorry, the totals as well. And maybe I want to see a line here. So I'm just using dashes right here to get a line between. And maybe these headings, they're kind of blending in too much. So I'm going to draw a line here so that it separates the headings from the body of the report. So let me save, and let's run this one more time. So that it stands out, looks a little bit nicer, a little bit easier to read. So I can see where the vendors stop and start because of the bolding. And then I can see where the totals come in. Again, not on the ones that have a single invoice. Okay, looks a little bit prettier. Now, the other thing you can do, I had mentioned earlier, you can work with the font. So if you come in under Format, and you go to Character, and you go to Font, you have an area here where you can change the font and the style and the size. You also have color option. So here's where you can change the color on a field. Okay. So again, it's not real fancy, but it's a way that you can kind of perk up these report designer reports if you'd like to. Okay. Okay, one last thing about the formulas, which we're going to be covering in session 2. There are 4 types of formulas that you can pull into a report design. We can do public formulas. These are the formulas that you design yourself outside of the report designer. They're going to reside in a file called user.frm, and you can use these formulas anywhere in the software. So anywhere where the software can use it, like in a payroll calculation would be one example. Or you can even pull these into your report designs. Now, these are different than application formulas. The application formula is something provided by Sage. Each module has its own set of hard-coded, maintained by Sage formulas. You can't change them, but you can copy them to a public formula and then change them. Design formulas are stored with the report design. So you create them inside the design, you name them, and if you need to, you can copy them out to public. So you can access them in other report designs or in other processing. And then lastly is a quick formula where you design it right in the column of the report. The only drawback to quick formulas are that you can't name them or copy them. They are specific to that particular column within the report design itself. Now, in our next session, we're going to be working with the formulas a little bit, and we're going to actually create formulas for this report that we just created. So we're going to talk again about the 4 different types of formulas, and we'll actually practice pulling some of those application formulas in. And then with the design formulas, I'm going to demonstrate to you some of the functions that you have available to you that can be pulled into the design formulas or even the public formulas. So formulas can be an important part of your report design. Okay. Now we've actually gone over the basics here. We did the defaults, we created a new design, we went over the header and the footer, we did the detail, we added fields, and some text. We deleted and moved things around. I showed you where the processing record is and what effect the sort order has on everything. We looked at formatting the different types of fields. We talked about the print control. We talked about totaling, line spacing, and conditions. So this is kind of a summary of what we covered in our session today. All right, so lastly, some tips and reminders. So again, the sort order of your report, it's more than just the order. So remember that. It's going to control your print controls, your summarization, your totaling levels. And as we get into some of the other areas in our next session, sort order has an effect on those things as well. Draw the report before you start. Use some type of an entry sheet or even blank paper. If you can draw the report, what you're looking to pull into that drawing is the column headings across the top, and then how the detail is going to print down the body. Once you get your headings across the top, you're going to start looking at the data dictionaries and print the ones that you think hold that information and look for those fields in those data dictionaries so that you can know which records to pull into the design. Reminder that every record has at least one key. So those are the standard orders, and those are listed at the bottom of the last page of that data dictionary. Start a binder. It's easier to look at those things on a printed sheet of paper than it is trying to scroll up and down through those records. Remember that if you add records to the design and you start creating the design, you cannot remove records off the design. So it's a good idea to have a good idea of what records you actually need. And you can tell that by looking at those data dictionaries. And lastly, keep saving your design. Once you've been in there for a while and you've got the majority of it built, click the Save button and give that report a name. And then as you continue on, keep clicking that Save button. All right, so we're done a little bit earlier. This is good. If anybody has any questions right now that you want to ask before we stop for the day, I'd be happy to answer. Or if you think of anything later after we've closed the session, you can email those to Tina, and she will forward those on to me, and I'll be happy to answer those for you. But if anybody has any questions right now, now since I'm connected to you and the software, I can show you where certain things are if we need to. So Tina, were there any questions?
No, I'm not seeing any at this point.
Okay, let's give them a minute to see if anybody has a question. Okay.
Nope, not seeing any yet. So
okay.
I guess you're
well,
pretty good at this stuff, you know?
I think we're good then. I want to thank you guys for joining me today, and don't forget that session 2 is happening in a couple of weeks, and we're going to be looking at the rest of the options with Report Writer, as well as going into some of the common formulas and functions. I think that'll be really helpful for those of you that have started designing your own reports. So again, thank you very much, and I hope to see you in session 2.